Okay, all right. My task today is to actually talk to you about rewilding, something that I'm very much interested in, and something that I've seen a change in really over my academic career. And what I want to do is just give you an overview if you're unfamiliar with what rewilding is. It sounds self-explanatory, but provide you with that overview. I want to look then a little bit about why it's needed, especially in an age of climate change, and then look at some of the remarkable work that's been done by some other folks that you might know here in Iowa who are either founders of or affiliated with BEWILD/REWILD. So here's the book Rewilding. This is actually a picture of the illustrated edition, which came out, I believe, last year. And I don't have the illustrated edition, so I don't have the nice edition that has all the good pictures in it. Instead, mine is just all text. But rewilding is a relatively new area that's recognized now within the ecological sciences themselves, but it's come out of kind of a long history where scientists have had to do a lot of self-discovery. And as you can see, I had to plumb the depth of this book all the way to page 1 to find some of that history. And just to give you an overview of where this comes out of, you've probably heard about ecological restoration or restoration ecology. Rewilding is kind of the next step. Why? Because as the quote here says, we have internalized ecological impoverishment in our science, culture, and institutions. This is one of the criticisms by ecologists of what ecologists have been doing. Imagine growing up in Iowa today, right? 97% of the land is privately owned. So you don't really know what public spaces are like. More than 98% of the land has been converted for agriculture, for cities and towns, for roadways, and for other human uses. So you don't really know what nature is like. But if you're 5 years old, if you're 10 years old, and then eventually 20 years old, that's just normal to you. So to you, having a little 2-acre park in your city, that's wildness, that's nature. But that is not at all what it used to be like. So each generation assumes the nature they experienced in their youth to be normal. That was one of the interesting problems that I had growing up, where I would watch shows like on PBS, the Nature program, you know, airing every Sunday night for I don't know how long now. And then I would look at Iowa and like, okay, but that's a cornfield. You know, and so it's like I came to know that I did not know really what wildness is. So we internalize this, and I say here in quotation or in parentheses, we unwittingly accept the degradations of previous generations. And here's where some scientists have tried to push the envelope. So I'll go back to 2 papers that were released in 2005 and 2006. And that's kind of probably about 15 years ago is the origins of the shift of our thinking in the scientific community about this. These papers were kind of radical and were resoundingly criticized by other scientists. But the first paper, and it was published in Science, said, okay, you want to restore areas? You want to make them natural and wild again? Well, what's your reference point? How about let's go back 10, 11,000 years. The glaciers are retreating, the mammoths and mastodons are still around. There's an amazing amount of biodiversity in these things we call grasslands today, and it's largely held together by these large herbivores and their associated large carnivores that could actually take them down. Systematically, however, there is some evidence that when humans came to this continent, we helped to make them go extinct through hunting pressure. So it's possible that when we talk about the degradations of previous generations, we can go back thousands of years and say, wow, we've really degraded the place. The second paper wasn't quite so controversial and you know, almost weird in its outlook. And we're going to bring back really? You want to import elephants to North America? What, you know? Instead, looked at the herds of bison and elk, you know, and deer species and all of those amazing herbivores. They used to be part of this amazing prairie landscape, and said, you know what? There used to be brown bears and black bears and mountain lions and coyotes and wolves, you know, all this whole range then also of large predators that would eat them. And they would help to keep the grasslands rich, complex, more biologically diverse. So as you can see here, I say they pointed out that these assemblies of, or the assemblages of these large vertebrates really drove the biological diversity and the food webs. So what they said basically is that we needed to focus less on the types of plants that are there, which is what we were doing in ecological restoration. When I learned about ecological restoration when I was in ecology, we had a Field of Dreams view of it. If you remember the movie Field of Dreams, and this farmer in Iowa, you know, is building this baseball stadium because he hears from his dead father that if you build it, they will come. And that's kind of what ecological restoration is about. If you build it, they will come. And by they, we meant, oh, the insects will come back if we put the plants there, maybe some of the smaller vertebrates as well. We understood the elk couldn't make it back, but largely they would come. But what was not being measured were all the functions, the ecological processes, the cycling of matter, the flow of energy that occurs in complex food webs. And therefore, what was also lost was what were the keystone species that held those ecosystems together? And there was not a focus on restoring the keystone species to those areas. So going to the Rewilding Institute here, I provide you with this quote. What is rewilding? Rewilding is comprehensive, often large-scale conservation effort. By large scale, they mean that the intention was continental scale. How do we have biodiversity that is sustainable without human management throughout the continent? That is really their vision. Focused on restoring sustainable biodiversity and ecosystem health. So by that, they mean we do not have to intervene to manage these areas. By protecting core wild areas or wilderness areas, I think they're making the distinction there kind of size, but also kind of philosophy there. Providing connectivity between such areas, so the vision is wildlife corridors would allow the dispersal of juveniles, would allow even plants to migrate northward, southward, east, west, and everywhere else along the compass when they need to, and protecting or reintroducing apex predators, because they are often keystone species, or what they call highly interactive species, and in parentheses, keystone species. So the focus on functionality. So this led to what are called the 3 C's of rewilding: cores, corridors, and carnivores. The cores are just relatively large protected areas. They can also be smaller, but protected areas that are large enough that the biodiversity that essentially should be in an area, at least looking back to pre-industrial times, so like 250 years ago or more, will be maintained. Corridors then connecting all of these areas so that populations can disperse, they can be healthy, there can be gene flow, no inbreeding, that sort of thing. And then of course, carnivores, their focus on carnivores is not just because carnivores are often keystone species, but also because there is a group within the Rewilding Institute that says if you look at the most maligned of all creatures, they are the big carnivores. For instance, we tell our kids the stories about the big bad wolf. We don't tell our kids stories about the big bad bison, right? The herbivores are portrayed as being nice and friendly, and the carnivores are always the ones that will eat you and your pets and your livestock and everything else. I always then, like in my classes, I then tell students about, yep, and that's, the selfie taker in Yellowstone just a couple years ago. Herd of bison stops all the cars on the highway. She gets out and is like, I'm going to take a selfie directly against this bison. Well, the bison didn't see her as this benevolent selfie taker. And so the onlookers then said, well, she was propelled about 20 feet through the air as the bison charged.
She approached the baby with the mother's
yeah. Baby. Okay, that was, I thought that was it. I thought there was a baby. And the mother was like, you're not getting close. I don't trust you. Yeah. So, yeah, we don't have the stories of the big bad bison, but they don't see us as being as benevolent as we think we are. But I also want to bring in a couple other things. So Michael Soleil is recently deceased. Reed Noss and Michael Soleil are giants in the field of conservation. Michael Soleil helped to found the entire field of conservation biology. These three C's largely came from them, but if we put it just a little bit differently, it makes sense. Large core protected areas, ecological connectivity, and then keystone species, which the Rewilding Institute says carnivores. All right. But we have added a couple other things to this. In an age of climate change, we also need to plan for climate resilience. And here in Iowa, that means that most of our species are moving north. This includes plants as well as animals. But if there's something that exists to the south of Sioux City, it can be difficult for them to get to the north of Sioux City because there's this thing called the city in the way. So the idea of connections, these corridors on the landscape, would allow that to happen. Beckhoff included something that I particularly like, which is compassion, right? It's often tough, it seems, to get a person to have compassion for their fellow human being. But can we also have compassion for the other creatures with which we share the land? You know, Aldo Leopold's vision, we are plain members and citizens of the biotic community. Not exactly plain members, because we have far more influence than other species do, but can we actually care for them? And this especially then concerns the type of species we often don't like, maybe the spiders, you know, the small fishes, the snakes, and of course, the carnivores. And then John said, what about coexistence? Because perhaps especially in Western civilization, the pattern has been when we populate an area, we get rid of the things that we think we are in conflict with. So let's get rid of the carnivores because they might eat our livestock, and let's get rid of the snakes, right? Because snakes are scary and you don't know if they're poisonous. My dad grew up in northeast Nebraska, and he told me that he was always taught by his folks that if you ever saw a snake, kill it. No matter what it was, whether it's a rattlesnake or not, you just kill snakes. It's just a good thing to do because it might be a rattlesnake, and who knows, someone might get bitten by it. So can we learn to coexist with these creatures that to us seem deadly or frightening? So let's now apply this to Iowa. Can this actually happen in our state? The state that really has had more changes for human purposes than any other state in the nation. So I have very shamelessly taken this from Mark Edwards' piece here, The Wildest Place in the World, because I read this a couple of years ago and found out that he very succinctly and nicely summarized so many good statistics. I was just going to use it. So Iowa has, as you can see here, roughly 36 million acres. Historically, it is estimated that nearly 70% of those 36 million acres were prairie. And it's primarily tall grass here in Iowa, but as you can see, 99.9% of the prairie is gone. Only roughly 30,000 acres exist now throughout the state. And we're fortunate to live in the part of Iowa that really has the largest intact tracts of prairie left. 10% wetlands, 98% of those have been drained, again, primarily for agriculture, also for cities and towns. Water quality, Linda was just telling us, you know, to ask her candidates about water quality. Yes, because Iowa is not known for having good water quality. Iowa was 20% woodlands, and this might include the oak savannas. I'm not entirely sure where the oak savannas go in here, but you can see 80% have been cut down. And a lot of the woodlands that we have left are actually changes, because if you look back a century ago, of course, farmers would have little woodlots and rows of trees, especially as windbreaks for the winter. And those trees were largely allowed to grow. So the woodlands we have in Iowa today are often in different places than they were historically, which can mean that they're not as well suited for some of our native plants and animals. And so this image here comes from the DNR. So at the top right, what that says, all other categories of agriculture. Hay, pasture, private forest, water, about 28% of Iowa is in all of that. 63%, not quite 2/3, are in croplands. So Row crop lands is the DNR's designation. That's pretty much corn and soybeans, as we know. Then, as we get down to the southwest there, what's left? 3% of Iowa, that's that next strip there that's kind of beige. I guess, yeah, it shows up beige there. Taupe, okay. I always need someone who knows colors. I don't know colors. That's the area that's taken up by all of our cities and towns, the human settlements. Right next to that, almost 3%, is all the roads. So if we take the number of acres that's covered by all of our roads, it's just about the size of all of our cities put together. Below that, 2%, finally, we get into some protected lands. But then I put over here on the left, well, wait a minute, 2% public lands, but half of those public lands are designated road right-of-ways. So they're roads or right alongside roads. So then we get to less than 1% that really is what we could call quality or halfway quality habitat for nature and natural areas. So this is the most biologically altered state, not just in the United States, but really in all of North America. I'm not aware of any part of Mexico being as biologically altered for human uses, nor Canada. So we live in a very unique place. If rewilding can take place in Iowa, it can take place anywhere. And in many ways, this is where it needs to happen. Briefly, I'm going to say why. An era of climate change, right? When I was an undergraduate, when I was even in graduate school, we learned about all of the environmental issues we had. There was always a theme to it. And the theme was, we have time, right? There are the problems, we have time to solve them. But now as I teach my students at university, I have to tell them, we don't have time anymore. It has to be done. It has to be done now, or we are looking at whole scale sweeping changes in biodiversity on the earth. And that means just ridiculous tons of extinctions. So we have to do something now. And it's mostly driven now by climate change as well as our habitat alterations. So just to put this in perspective, I give you a lot of numbers here. 450 petagrams, that equals 1 billion kilograms. A kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So we're talking about 990 or so billion pounds of carbon is currently stored, it's estimated, in all of the world's intact ecosystems. And it's estimated to be less than half of what used to be there, say, 10,000 years ago, prior to whole-scale changes to the landscape done by us. So the idea of putting carbon back into the air can now be reversed. This is actually hopeful for us, because if we rewild places and we replant areas, those plants are going to be sucking that carbon back out of the atmosphere. So rewilding is actually a way to help combat what has happened. Degraded grasslands, of course, one of the problems we have is grasslands are amazing areas for root systems. Forests are too. Generally, there's more mass for vegetation underneath the soil than there is above the soil. And that's particularly true in grasslands. So if we can restore grasslands, we are storing lots and lots of carbon back into the soils. And of course, in agricultural terms, this is called restorative agriculture. Now, that's probably going to require a change in some of our policies to support farmers, but restorative agriculture could be part of this. So what does all this mean? Well, let's look back at the species. Species are on the move. This is a summary of many different studies. There's a lot of studies now that link that. The question is, does climate change cause changes in ecosystems? Does climate change cause species to move on the landscape? The answer is yes. Sometimes we have to get there by roundabout ways. Sometimes we can almost directly measure this. But on continents, species are moving poleward. And what that means is that if they're in the southern hemisphere, they're moving south toward the South Pole. And if they're in the northern hemisphere, they're moving north toward the North Pole. And that is an amazing finding that is not entirely exclusive, but almost exclusive. Biologically, of course, we always find a lot of differences in the data, but here there aren't many differences. We're not finding too many species that are moving toward where it's hotter, toward the equator. They're moving away from the equator. As they move, the compositions of our ecosystems are changing. Plants are appearing where they did not used to exist. Certain animals are appearing where they did not used to exist. Carnivores and herbivores are now interacting with each other who never met before because of these movements on the landscape. This is completely rewriting biodiversity on the planet, and it's because of climate change. So going back to that middle C for the 3 C's for rewilding, corridors. Do we need them? Yes, because corridors can connect these main protected areas so that species can move. Because if we confine them to a particular park, which has kind of been our vision, and in fact, a lot of our Western parks, if you've seen, they're now called donut parks. Because what will happen is when we designate a protected area, well, then we can use all of the other area around it. And so people who have money are building these nice houses right next to, say, the Yellowstone ecosystem, or right next to Grand Teton National Park, so that they literally have paradise out their back window. But if they literally have paradise out their back window, where do the bison go when it's a really hard winter? Right, now you have direct wildlife-human conflict, and we all know how that goes. So we need corridors. So let's look at how this can happen. Well, the states of Oregon and New Mexico have already passed corridor legislation. In Oregon, if I remember right, that went into effect in 2020. In New Mexico, it went into effect in 2021. I've since heard of at least one more state that passed it, and I can't remember which one it is. But the whole idea of wildlife corridors is to link any natural areas that are remaining in those states. And the way they're sold to legislatures is this will prevent vehicle collisions with large wildlife, thus protecting people as well as our property. And it actually works. And in fact, if you're not aware of it, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is continually reintroduced into Congress, and the House of Representatives last year in 2021 passed that. It stalled in the Senate, but we could have national funding for wildlife corridors throughout our 50 states if that were to pass. So, I should mention, this picture is actually over in Europe, and the trees there are little tracts of forest. The rest is used as pasture land, and so native wildlife can actually use the forest to actually traverse the landscape and not have to interact with the people, as well as probably the dogs that are protecting the wildlife. Whereas this, of course, is your general idea of an overpass, a wildlife overpass for highways. As much as 96% fewer collisions with wildlife have occurred. That was one study in Virginia that showed that. But between 80 and 95% reductions in wildlife collisions with vehicles happen once overpasses are put over highways. Highways don't have to be this big. They can just be, regular highways outside of Sioux City. And what I put here in white, I'll read to you. Can this happen in Iowa? Well, that's a good question. And I had a couple students and I explored that. We actually submitted this to our local representative. And it was the Iowa Wildlife Corridors Act is what we called it. It didn't go anywhere, unfortunately, but maybe it's a start. This was part of it. Section 3 Wildlife Corridors Action Plan. Creation, Department Coordination. What this says is the State Department of Natural Resources shall collect, analyze, and develop the best available science and data regarding the connectivity of wildlife habitat areas. The State Department of Natural Resources, in cooperation with the Department of Transportation, shall use the data to develop a plan to be known as the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan to preserve long-term habitat connectivity for wildlife. The plan shall provide guidance for all state agencies to develop benchmarks for the designation and protection of wildlife corridors in Iowa. So this would establish those corridors. And of course, as a scientist, I'm like, wow, we need to study this a lot. And where the corridors actually work well, and which, highways have the most traffic and the most wildlife vehicle collisions. And we just looked at the acts that passed in New Mexico and Oregon. And I was like, wow, I am thinking so wrong. I should think like a politician. What you do is you say, hey, we do need this data. So you guys who work for us at the DNR and at the Department of Transportation, you study this and report back to us. And that's all the act had to say. I was like, this could be passed very quickly because then the idea of that wildlife corridor action plan, that's what would be submitted back to the legislature. And then the legislature would have to approve that plan before it's ever implemented in Iowa. But in approving that plan, they would then designate monies to go for actually restoring corridors in Iowa to link all of our natural areas together. But there is perhaps a better vision, and certainly a much more comprehensive vision for rewilding in Iowa. Again, I have to turn to the folks at BEWILDREWILD. And the little section of their website that I'm taking this from even says, this is from Ross Gipple. So I'm going to give Roger Ross Gipple the credit for this, and he definitely has a vision for what it would be to rewild. But we also have to say that Mark Edwards and Leland Sorrells and other folks that have contributed so much to BEWILD/REWILD. Ross Gipple is a farmer and has been a farmer here in Iowa, and he wants to see Iowa remain largely as private lands. If you read the recent Sierra magazine that just came out, there is a story on rewilding in Iowa in there. And Leland, in fact, right here is the story. And this is the recent magazine that came out. Leland Sorrells is actually interviewed in here. Kelly Madigan is also interviewed. And here they point out that roughly 97% of Iowa is in private land ownership. And Ross Gipple's vision is not really to change that. He likes private land ownership. But his vision is to say, look, there are parts of Iowa that are currently farmed. They're either under row crops or they're grazed, and they're not very suitable for that. They are floodplains that are flooded either once every 5 years on average, or more often than that. Farmers know that's marginal land, and they're not really going to make much money, if any, from planting on that land. Also, we have slopes that are steeper than 9%. The erosion is tremendous on those slopes. Some of them are still used for row crops. Some of them are used for grazing. Let's retire those as well, because those are largely also unsuitable and not very productive agricultural lands. So his idea is, why don't we focus on the marginal lands, not the best agricultural land. The best agricultural land, by the way, would also be the most biodiverse supporting land. But let's just focus on the marginal land, because this is Iowa. This is a state of farms, and we don't want to put farmers out of business. And if we do that, then perhaps we could rewild up to about 25% of Iowa. That's amazing. We went from less than 2% natural areas to just about 1/4 of the state being natural areas. And then if we get back to that problem of kids growing up in Iowa accepting the current condition as the way that it kind of ought to be, well, that's a much better vision for the way it ought to be. Well, how would we get there? And here's part. They say a lot more BEWILD/REWILD about how to get there. But part of how to get there, as you can see, is buyout programs for some farmlands so that those lands can be retired from agriculture. And again, these are the very marginal lands. These are the lands that farmers really are not making money and probably are losing money on anyway. If farmers don't want to sell, fine, have some financial incentives for them. Work with our federal representatives. The Conservation Reserve Program, you probably know, will put lands into conservation reserve for only 10 years. And then you have to apply to renew it. So Ross Gipple says, well, why can't that just be permanent? Why can't a farmer just elect to say, as long as I own this land, this is conservation land? So maybe that's a change that could be made. Work with land trusts to acquire land. The state legislature has actually at times prevented the Department of Natural Resources from buying land that farmers want to sell. Well, land trusts are not, they're private entities, so they're not constricted by what the legislator says. So if a farmer wants to sell part of his or her land, they could potentially buy that and put it into conservation. And then, of course, there can be other grant programs, tax relief programs, watershed protection programs, et cetera, that can provide financial incentive, and Ross Gipple hopes generous financial incentive for any landowners, farmers or otherwise, to actually restore their land and conserve parts of their land. And of course, it's the landowners who ultimately will determine that. But they haven't stopped there. These are screenshots that I took on my computer. If you go to BEWILDREWILD'S website, they have a rather amazing mapping feature. And on this map, it's basically an interactive GIS, Geographic Information Systems map. And they have a lot of different layers, and you can go all the way out, see the entire Mississippi River watershed, or you can zoom in, as I have here, to just the state of Iowa, and I will zoom in further yet and show you some of this vision. What you can see here is the red areas are proposed corridor areas that would have to cross farms. So part of the farmland would need to be put into conservation land in order for those corridors to be realized. Otherwise, the corridors largely follow many of the waterways of Iowa. If Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, and actually they have over 50,000 lakes, Iowa's the land of rivers. We have lots of rivers draining our landscape. And so a lot of the proposed wildlife corridors would actually be along rivers anyway, which not only would be good for wildlife, but also is good to retire from farming, because if you farm right up to the river, you start to degrade the river, and Iowa is known for having poor water quality, partly as a result of this. So there's a lot of social benefits, there's a lot of environmental benefits in their vision here. The yellow, or does it show up as, it shows up a little bit more as beige, or maybe that taupe again? Gold. So if you can see it, it doesn't show up quite as well there as it does on my screen, but the kind of golden areas are main corridor areas that would need to be established, but those don't necessarily have to go directly across farmland. So not necessarily across private space. As you can see here, there's a lot of designated green areas, but let's zoom in. So you can see there on the left-hand side, that's Sioux City. And one of the things you can see there is you can see the kind of the black line outline of the city itself. Then there's a white border that extends around there. So BEWILD's vision is to have, if I remember right, it's a 1 mile buffer zone around all human settlements. Right? Let's have mixed use lands there. Let's not put conservation lands right up to the edge of a city. And that also allows a city, a village, room to expand if they so choose. So buffer zones between our intensive use of land and wildlife land. And then here we zoom in just a little bit more. You can see there's Correctionville kind of to the bottom of the center there. So we're a little bit east. If you go out on Highway 20, of course, we go right through Correctionville. What is that? 20 minutes away, 25 minutes away, something like that. It's not that far away. And as you can see, to the north of Correctionville, we have a gold area and we have a red area. And the gold area, again, would be a very good potential conservation corridor for movement of Iowa's plants and animals, whereas the red area, we would need to negotiate with farmers. As one of the things that Ross Gipple is looking for now, he's looking for folks who have the vision to go out, talk with farmers, talk about what's best for them, talk about these sorts of plans, and say, are you interested at all in putting any part of your land into conservation reserve? If you're not interested in that, would you be interested in selling to a land trust? something like that, so that it could be put into conservation reserve. And if we did this, again, the vision would be roughly a quarter of the state would eventually be rewilded and would be for nature. And I say here, and our spirits, because after all, as Aldo Leopold said, I mean, this is the time of the pasque flower, right? There are some of us who are more interested in seeing a pasque flower bloom in early spring than in seeing what the brand new cars are that people are buying and putting onto our roads. More interested in that than what iPhone is coming out this month or whatever, you know. Our spirits can be renewed by this as well. Again, the corridors will largely follow the waterways. We're not condemning good agricultural land. And in fact, the plan here does not include eminent domain at all. The plan is all private people negotiating with other private people, landowners, to say where would be good for the conservation corridors to go in. Current reserves, that roughly 2% of Iowa, will be maintained. Other programs would come in. There are buffer zones around settlements, and the vast majority, so if 97% of Iowa is still in private land ownership, if BEWILDREWILD'S vision were to come true, it would still be about the same proportion of land in private ownership. So again, I like Aldo Leopold, so I like his phrasing. The upshot of it all is this: Iowa would not become a place under this vision where mountain lions could really return and inhabit the state. We're not going to have packs of wolves roaming around, and we're certainly not going to have mammoths and you know that. But we would still largely raise food for humans. It would be a much better place for much of the biodiversity that still exists in Iowa and other types of biodiversity that used to exist in Iowa. And all of these corridors through Iowa will be REWILD has been working also in neighboring states. In some areas of neighboring states, think South Dakota, there are some very large areas that would be suitable for these large vertebrates. And our corridors can link to corridors in South Dakota, which can link to those extremely large reserves. And so the vision for REWILD in Iowa might be, as I say here at the end, maybe Iowa becomes a land of restored wildlife corridors. So that would be REWILD in Iowa. Any questions, comments?
When you were talking about carbon storage, I've been wondering how prairie disposal now, how does that compare to like a forest in the conservation program? Do you know that?
Okay, so the question is about carbon storage in forests versus in prairies. Is there more or less in the forests or in the prairies?
Yeah.
In the prairies, what we're really looking at is underground storage. Because what happens is the carbon becomes part of the soil biomass itself. I mean, after all, that's how we got our rich soils. You look at a farm field, if it's black, it contains a lot of carbon, and that means you can grow a lot of crops there. There's some evidence that acre for acre, prairies might actually store a little bit more carbon than your average forest. And it's because of the underground biomass that is generated. And not only that, then there's a rich community of tiny little animals and other organisms that also then exist there, and they too are part of the carbon storage. Either way, there's other evidence that forests, of course, one tree has a lot more biomass in it than one stem of, your blue stem or something like that, but there's a lot more grasses than there are trees.
Yeah, I kind of think we get undersold. I don't hear that nationally very much.
Yeah. Yeah, and they talk a lot about planting trees. Our Governor Reynolds has talked about planting trees, and that's how she's being, kind environmentally. And I'm like, okay, where are you planting trees in this land of prairie?
Yeah,
But actually, restoring prairie can actually pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. The other thing is too, that regenerative agriculture. So we still will have tons and tons of farms in Iowa under this vision. And if we start agriculture, what happens is, like when farmers till the soil and turn it over, it exposes a lot of the stored carbon to oxygen, which means that actually the decomposers decompose that carbon faster and it gets put back into the air faster. So there are methods of maintaining farms and still having them be tremendously productive that would actually help to store more carbon into the soils, regenerative agriculture as it's called, which can be practiced on small scale or it can be practiced on large scale. And if we do that, that also would be a tremendous help in pulling carbon out of the atmosphere.